They gave him my promotion, my project, my strategy, my long hours. Then they smiled and asked me to train him. I smiled back. But I was already planning exactly how I would make the truth unignorable. My name is Claire Reynolds. I'm 33. I work in corporate strategy at a mid-sized manufacturing firm in Charlotte, North Carolina. If that sounds dry, it is. But I loved it. I liked solving problems no one else could see, forecasting trends before they materialized, building models that told the truth even when people didn't want to hear it. I kept my head down, delivered results, and stayed out of office politics. Until politics swallowed me whole. I'd spent 10 months building a comprehensive expansion plan, new market analysis, vendor partnerships, cost projections. I worked late most nights. Not for applause, but because I couldn't do mediocre work and sleep at night. My manager, Stuart, had once told me I had the sharpest mind on his team. The promotion's coming soon, he said back in January. Just stay patient. So I stayed. But patience, I learned, is what they tell women like me when they're already giving what's yours to someone else. The announcement came in a team meeting on a rainy Thursday. Everyone was half listening, scrolling through emails. Stuart cleared his throat and said, "I'd like to officially welcome Brian Sullivan as our new senior strategy lead." There was a beat of silence. My stomach dropped. Brian? Brian, who joined barely a year ago from some flashy consultancy, who quoted jargon in meetings and interrupted me constantly. Brian, who asked me 2 weeks ago what EBITDA stood for. There was polite applause. My face stayed still. My pulse did not. I forced a smile. The rest of the meeting blurred. I said nothing. Afterward, Stuart caught me by the elevator. "I know you probably have questions," he said, voice low, like I was a child he'd just disappointed. I said, "No questions. Just surprised." He nodded, looking relieved. "This wasn't easy, Claire. You've done amazing work. But Brian brings a different kind of energy." That word, energy, buzzed in my ears the rest of the day. I stayed late again that night. Alone in the fluorescent quiet of the office, I reopened all the files I'd created. My projections. My models. The vendor reports. My fingerprints were on every page of the strategy they'd just promoted Brian to lead. And now, they wanted me to train him. I did, quietly. He'd ask, "How did you estimate this?" or "Which supplier gave us the best margin again?" I'd answer politely, watching him scribble down my answers as if they were his own. Each time, I thought of my mother's voice in my head, "Don't get bitter. Get better." But bitterness has edges, and mine had begun to sharpen. That Friday, I received an email from HR, mandatory meeting, Monday morning. No agenda listed. I clicked it open, stared at the screen. My fingers hovered above the keyboard. Then I closed my laptop and sat in the dark, wondering what they could possibly take from me now. But I wasn't preparing to fight anymore. I was preparing to expose. And I already knew exactly where to begin. They never saw me cry. Not once. That was my private war, silent, methodical, and invisible to the people who thought they could erase me with a smile. That weekend, I drove 4 hours to the lake house my grandfather left me. No one knew about it, not my coworkers, not even my closest friends. It was where I went when I needed to remember who I was before the compromises. I lit the fireplace even though it wasn't that cold and sat on the floor with my laptop and an old leather notebook I'd kept since college. The pages were filled with ink-smudged diagrams, budget outlines, scribbled quotes from business lectures, and even a list of goals I'd made when I was 22, make something real. Be respected, not liked. Never apologize for being smarter than the room. I hadn't looked at that list in years. When I got into business school, my father took me out to dinner and said, not unkindly, "Just don't lose your humanity trying to prove a point." He meant well, but he didn't understand. For men like him, dignity was a given. For women like me, it had to be earned every day. In the quiet of the cabin, I reopened the internal servers I still had access to, documents, performance reviews, timestamps. My files were still there. But I noticed something. One of the budget workbooks I had created was now labeled Sullivan_Rev2. It was my spreadsheet. The formulas were identical, the formatting untouched, even the typo in cell F214. I copied it. And then I kept going. I downloaded every report, email thread, and timestamp that linked my work to that expansion strategy. Then I pulled up the internal team logs. Sure enough, every document Brian had submitted had a creation date from weeks earlier, when I was still working overtime, alone in that conference room after everyone else had gone home. The theft wasn't even subtle. It was lazy. Sunday morning, I sat with a cup of coffee and stared out at the lake, the surface rippling under a quiet wind. I thought of my grandfather, who built his own logistics company from scratch after 2 layoffs and a bankruptcy in the 80s. He used to say, "Truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to be written down." He taught me to read contracts before signing anything, to document every meeting, and to never assume silence meant safety. It was his voice I heard when I found the audio file. I'd forgotten I'd recorded that team strategy session back in March, the one where Brian kept checking his phone while I explained the supply chain model to the group. "I'll send the finalized plan out this week," I had said. "But this draft shows our margin projections if we diversify vendor sourcing by Q3. In the background of the recording, you could hear Brian say, "Good stuff, Claire. I'll clean it up and push it through." It was subtle, but damning. I added the audio to my file archive, labeled everything meticulously, and encrypted the drive. I wasn't sure what I was going to do with it yet. But it was ready. Just in case. Monday morning came and I arrived 10 minutes early for the HR meeting. It was in one of the glass-walled conference rooms on the 5th floor. Transparent. Exposed. Like they wanted me to feel watched. Stuart was already there, along with Camille from HR and a junior rep I didn't recognize. I sat down, my expression neutral. Camille smiled too warmly and launched into the kind of sanitized language I'd come to expect. "Claire, we just wanted to check in on your adjustment to the new reporting structure." I nodded. Stuart chimed in, "We're really hoping you and Brian can build a strong partnership moving forward. Your collaboration is essential to this team." Essential. That word again. I said, "Is this meeting disciplinary in nature?" Camille blinked. No. This is just a check-in." I looked at Stuart. He wouldn't meet my eyes. They didn't say it, but I heard it, "Stay quiet. Keep the peace. Be a good soldier." I thanked them for their time, stood up, and walked out with my hands steady at my sides. That afternoon, I scheduled PTO for the rest of the week. No one asked why. No one cared. Which was perfect. Because I needed time to finish something I'd been putting off for too long. That night, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in 3 years, business plans I once drafted for a boutique consulting firm I never had the nerve to start. Ideas that felt too risky. Too ambitious. I wasn't afraid anymore. But I needed to do one last thing before I closed this chapter. And I knew exactly who to call. They didn't take my job. They took my name off something I'd built with my bare hands. And then they waited to see if I'd just quietly disappear. But disappearing was never the plan. I called Marissa that same evening. She picked up on the second ring, her voice tired but warm. We hadn't spoken in months, not since she left the firm under what I now understood wasn't mutual consent. She'd been our senior market analyst, brilliant, composed, the kind of woman who asked hard questions in meetings and didn't pretend to laugh at Stuart's jokes. They called her difficult on her way out. I called her honest. I said, "I think I'm about to do something that might burn every bridge I built here." She said, "Then you'd better make it worth the smoke." We met the next day at a quiet coffee shop in Dilworth, far from the office, far from familiar eyes. I brought my laptop, the encrypted files, and something I hadn't felt in weeks: direction. She listened without interrupting as I laid everything out: the data theft, the HR ambush, the falsified reports now bearing Brian's name. Her expression never changed. When I finished, she sat back and said, "They always pick the man with charm over the woman with results. But charm fades. Documentation doesn't." I asked if she knew anyone at the press. "Not the tabloids or gossip blogs, real investigative reporters." She gave me a name and told me to sit tight. Do nothing publicly yet. Let me feel the ground. For the next 2 days, I said almost nothing to anyone. I ignored emails. Let calls go to voicemail. Walked the greenway for hours. There was an eerie kind of peace in the silence, like standing inside the eye of a hurricane. I knew the storm was still circling. But for once, I wasn't running. Thursday morning, I opened my inbox and saw a single-line email from Marissa: "Meet Nora Friday. She knows what to do." Nora Lively wrote for a niche business watchdog publication. She'd spent years exposing corporate fraud, inequity in promotions, whistleblower cases that never made the headlines but quietly changed policy. We met in the back of a bookstore cafe. She wore no makeup, carried a leather-bound notepad, and didn't waste time on pleasantries. She said, "Tell me everything. Don't hold back." I told her everything. At the end, she said, "I'll need copies. Clean records, audio, metadata if you have it." I handed her a drive. I had everything in triplicate. Nora didn't flinch. "They won't take this quietly. You know that." I nodded. "You prepared to lose your job?" I didn't answer right away. Then I said, "They already took the part that mattered." The next week passed slowly. I returned to work, quiet and professional. Brian kept trying to loop me into meetings I was no longer required to attend. Stuart copied me on memos with vague updates and shallow thanks for my past contributions. I responded with polite, efficient nothingness. They were trying to freeze me out without firing me. It was the classic corporate play: make someone invisible until they quit. Easier for HR that way. Cleaner for optics. But I wasn't playing their game. I was playing mine. Then came the day Nora called. "It's going live tomorrow," she said. "We've verified everything. Legal's cleared it." I felt a pulse behind my ribs like the beginning of a drumbeat. "What should I expect?" She said, "Fallout. Then silence. Then change." The next morning, the article dropped just before 9 a.m. The headline was sharp, measured, and unignorable: "Internal sabotage and gendered theft, the silent cost of corporate promotions." I sat at my desk and watched the email threads light up. By 10:17, Camille from HR had scheduled an all-hands meeting. By noon, Brian's office door was closed, and his assistant was red-faced and near tears. By 2 p.m., Stuart was nowhere to be found. And by 4:05, I received an email from our legal department requesting a private meeting. I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I packed my laptop slowly and walked to that meeting like a woman with nothing left to lose. But I wasn't thinking about consequences anymore. I was thinking about how silence is often mistaken for weakness. And how wrong they were about me from the beginning. They didn't ask if I wanted to stay. They asked how much I'd take to disappear. It was that blunt. That cowardly. The legal rep, Mark something, mid-40s, polished in that muted corporate way, didn't even bother with small talk. I was shown into a conference room, where a folder already sat at the center of the table like a trap disguised as protocol. He gestured toward it. He said, "We'd like to resolve this in a way that honors everyone's contributions." I said nothing. He opened the folder. Inside was a severance package thick with legalese, confidentiality clauses, and language like "without admission of fault." It included a payout that looked generous on paper: 18 weeks' salary, benefits continuation, and a vague offer of a reference letter upon request. What it didn't include was acknowledgement. Or apology. Mark folded his hands and waited, as though the shape of my future could be measured in silence. I didn't touch the folder. I asked one question. I said, "Has Brian been fired?" He hesitated. Then said, "He's on leave. Pending an internal review." I nodded once, stood, and walked out without another word. Outside, the hall felt colder than it should have. My heels echoed against the tile like footsteps through a mausoleum. Nobody made eye contact. My name was now a keyword in too many inboxes. A liability. Back at my desk, I opened the package again and read it carefully this time. Every line was tailored to silence me. And maybe, in another life, I would have signed it. Taken the money. Started over. But not this one. I drafted a single-line reply to legal, "I decline your terms." And then I went home and didn't speak to anyone for 3 days. There's a peculiar exhaustion that comes after survival, when your body finally registers that you're safe, but your mind still races like you're in a burning building. I cleaned my apartment compulsively, reorganized every drawer, deleted over 4,000 unread emails. I even scrubbed the grout in my bathroom, as if control could be restored molecule by molecule. On the 4th day, I called Marissa again. She didn't say "I told you so." She didn't need to. Instead, she said, "You ready to do something that scares you a little?" I was already scared. But I was also something else, emptier, lighter, dangerous in a way I hadn't been in years. I said, "Yes." She introduced me to a former client of hers, Gwen Larkin, a quiet powerhouse who ran an independent consultancy that specialized in corporate restructuring. Gwen had built a small empire in the shadow of every company that underestimated her. She liked damaged systems. Liked turning chaos into solvency. Liked women who'd been underestimated and were done asking for permission. We met in her converted loft office downtown. It smelled like cedarwood and old books. Gwen had sharp eyes and spoke like she hated wasting words. She said, "Marissa says you're good. Show me." So I did. I laid out everything I'd built for the expansion strategy, then everything Brian had copied, misused, watered down. I showed her the market forecasting tools I'd designed in my own time, the vendor comparison matrices, the staff training modules no one had asked for but everyone had used. She said, "You built this alone?" I said, "No one else stayed late." She smiled like someone recognizing their own reflection in another face. Then she said, "I want you on my team. Not as staff. As a partner." My throat tightened at that. I didn't say yes immediately. I asked for time. Not because I wasn't ready, but because I needed to finish something before I could begin again. That night, I went back through the last year's messages. I printed out one thread in particular, a long, meandering exchange between Stuart and Brian discussing performance metrics. In one line, Stuart had written, "Let's position this as Brian's initiative. Claire's not exactly visible leadership." I highlighted it in red. Then I folded the page, sealed it in an envelope, and addressed it to my old business school professor, the one now writing a book on internal bias in promotion structures. He'd emailed me months ago asking for real-world examples. I had one now. On Friday, I walked back into the office for what I knew would be the last time. I didn't go to my desk. I didn't check in with anyone. I went straight to Camille in HR, handed her my own resignation letter, and said, "This is my closure." She looked startled. Maybe even relieved. Then she said, "Do you want an exit interview?" I said, "You already had it." I walked out without looking back. That evening, Gwen sent over the official partnership agreement. I signed it slowly, deliberately. My name looked different on the bottom of a contract that didn't require me to shrink. But just before I hit send, I hesitated. Because I still had one more thing to do. And it wouldn't wait much longer. He still didn't know I'd been the one who gave the reporter everything. So when Brian called asking to meet, I agreed. I chose the coffee shop near the courthouse downtown, public, neutral, with wide windows and sharp acoustics. I arrived first. Ordered nothing. Sat in the corner booth where I could see the door and not be surprised. Old habits. When he walked in, he looked tired. Not ruined, just smaller. He scanned the room like someone expecting judgment in every glance. But people barely noticed him. That was the cruel irony of his fall. After all that posing and performance, he'd finally become invisible. He sat down and smiled like we were old friends reconnecting over brunch. He said, "You look well." I replied, "You don't." He laughed, a short, brittle sound. Then looked down at his hands. No watch. No ring. Just faint ink smudges on his thumb, like he'd been writing something and couldn't finish it. He said, "I didn't know it would get this bad." I said nothing. He leaned in slightly, lowering his voice. "They suspended me. No severance. My name's radioactive right now. Even firms I never worked for are ghosting me." I let the silence stretch. Then he said, "You sent that file, didn't you?" I met his eyes. There was no accusation there. Just the tired inevitability of someone who'd finally understood he wasn't invincible. I said, "You used my work. My name wasn't on anything. And you got promoted for it." He said, "It wasn't like that." I said, "Then explain how it was." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. Instead, he said, "You always acted like it didn't matter to you. Recognition, title. I thought you didn't care." I stared at him. I wanted to say something sharp, something final. But I realized it didn't matter anymore. His apology, if that's what this was, wasn't for me. It was for him. So I asked the only question that still lingered. I said, "Did Stuart put you up to it?" Brian hesitated. His fingers curled slightly on the tabletop. He said, "He told me to use whatever resources I needed. And when I showed him your files, he just nodded. Said it was smart to delegate. That you didn't push for credit anyway. That was all I needed." He didn't know I'd already sent Stuart's emails to Nora. Didn't know I'd declined every settlement offer. Didn't know I'd turned down 2 job interviews last week because I didn't want to be part of someone else's hierarchy ever again. I stood up to leave. He didn't follow. As I reached the door, he said, "I really am sorry." I turned just enough to meet his eyes. I said, "That's between you and the mirror." Then I walked out, calm and intact. 2 hours later, I stepped into the conference room of a boutique architecture firm whose leadership team had asked me to consult. They were losing money on expansion projects and hemorrhaging talent. I'd reviewed their entire operational strategy over the weekend. Now, I stood at the head of the table and walked them through what they'd been missing. Halfway through my pitch, I realized something strange. No one interrupted me. Not once. They asked questions, took notes, made space. It felt unfamiliar. Which was sad, but also electrifying. Afterward, the CEO, a woman named Dana who'd built the firm from a kitchen table in her 20s, offered me a standing retainer. Gwen was right. There were companies desperate for strategic clarity and sick of overconfident consultants who knew buzzwords but not business. That night, I opened my laptop and formalized the LLC Gwen and I had drafted weeks earlier. We called it Tracer Analytics. Quiet name. Sharp purpose. No frills. But it was mine. I wrote our mission statement slowly, deliberately. We see what others overlook. We say what others are afraid to. Then I hit publish. The next morning, I received a message on LinkedIn from a woman named Renee. Mid-level strategy officer at a large tech firm. She'd read the article. Said it reminded her of her own story. She ended her message with, "Do you take outside clients yet?" I stared at that sentence for a long time. Then typed, "Yes. I do now." But before I hit send, another email came through. Subject line, request for statement, internal review committee. From the company I'd just left. They wanted me to testify. On the record. Officially. Legally. And suddenly, I realized the confrontation wasn't over. Not yet. I thought I had walked away clean. But justice never travels in a straight line. It circles back, waiting for you to decide whether you'll finish what you started. I stared at the email for a long time. The request was formal, sterile in its phrasing. The Internal Review Committee was gathering statements regarding the events leading to Brian Sullivan's suspension and the subsequent media attention. They invited me to provide my perspective. Invited. Not subpoenaed. Not summoned. Just gently, legally, coaxed. It was a line in the sand they were drawing without getting their shoes dirty. I knew what it meant. They weren't ready to claim responsibility, but they were afraid. Afraid I'd keep talking, keep sharing, keep naming names. I didn't reply immediately. Instead, I closed the email and went for a walk, no phone, no destination. Just movement. I followed the sidewalks of my neighborhood in quiet loops, hands deep in my coat pockets, heart ticking like a metronome. The early spring air still held its chill, the kind that numbs you just enough to remember you're alive. I thought about everything that had happened. Not just the betrayal. But the years before it. The quiet erasure. The way people spoke over me in meetings. The way credit migrated away from my name like it had somewhere better to be. I remembered the first time I stayed late, not for approval but because I genuinely cared whether the numbers added up. I remembered printing a report at midnight, realizing I was the only one left on the floor, and thinking, naively, that dedication would always be noticed. I thought about the way Stuart used to say things like Claire's just naturally detail-oriented like it was a compliment, while simultaneously giving strategic credit to someone louder. Someone male. And I thought about the women who'd sent me messages since the article. Dozens. Maybe more. Each one with their own version of what I'd lived through. Each one echoing the same question. How do you stay standing when the floor gives out? I went home and made tea. Sat at my kitchen table with the email open again. Then I wrote my statement. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't angry. It was factual. I listed timelines. Responsibilities. Direct quotes from meetings. Attached redacted documents that corroborated every point. And then, at the very end, I wrote one sentence that wasn't documentation, it was truth. I wrote, the cost of being silent was never just mine to bear. I sent it at 1:43 a.m. The next morning, I woke up to a response. The committee thanked me. They said my statement would be entered into the official record. And they said something else. They said Stuart had submitted his resignation. The email was careful to frame it as voluntary. In the interest of moving forward and rebuilding trust. But I knew the language. I'd written it for them once. Brian's status remained under review. But that didn't matter anymore. Because I hadn't submitted my statement to punish him. I'd done it to mark a line. One that wouldn't be erased again. Later that week, Gwen and I signed the lease on our new office space. It wasn't flashy. A corner unit in a refurbished warehouse with exposed brick and sunlight that pooled across the floor like permission. We kept it simple, 2 desks, 1 large whiteboard, a kettle for tea. A corkboard on the wall where I pinned a single page, our first client agreement. Not because of what it said, but because of what it represented. Proof that building something from nothing was not only possible, it was powerful. That afternoon, a letter arrived at my home address. A physical letter, not an email. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, with a corporate seal embossed at the top. Inside was a formal apology from the firm. Not from Stuart. Not from Brian. From the new interim director of strategy. She acknowledged the mishandling of internal credit attribution. She acknowledged the harm done by the promotional process. She even included language about reviewing internal systems to prevent future incidents. And there, in the final paragraph, she wrote, "We recognize your integrity, your contribution, and your grace. And we regret that it took public exposure for this acknowledgement to occur. There was no check inside. Just words. But for once, they were the right ones. I tucked the letter into the back of my filing cabinet, behind my signed LLC paperwork. I didn't need to frame it. I didn't need to forget it either. That night, I hosted Gwen and Marissa for dinner. We drank wine, laughed about the irony of surviving corporate warfare only to end up drafting analytics contracts over pasta. And somewhere between clearing plates and refilling glasses, my phone buzzed. A new email. From a Fortune 500 company. Subject: Request for consultation, Executive Team Crisis Response. I looked at it, let the screen glow in my palm. And slowly, carefully, I began to smile. Sometimes the victory doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like silence, clean, weightless, and final. 3 weeks later, I walked into the boardroom of a company that had once ghosted me. Now they were paying for my time. The irony wasn't lost on me, but I didn't carry it like armor. I carried it like evidence. Of what persistence can do. Of what restraint can become. The crisis they faced wasn't so different from the one I'd lived through. A failed promotion. An internal leak. A woman with receipts. The CEO, polished and publicly progressive, was suddenly asking hard questions about culture, equity, leadership. He said, "We want to make sure this never happens again." I replied, "Then start with the people who made it happen in the first place." The table went quiet. I didn't flinch. I walked them through a step-by-step breakdown of where their leadership model had failed: blind loyalty, inconsistent accountability, policies that looked good on paper but were never enforced. I didn't attack. I simply revealed. That became my method. Reveal, not accuse. Reframe, not destroy. It worked. People listen differently when they aren't busy defending themselves. By the time I left, they'd requested a long-term contract. Gwen negotiated the terms by the end of the week. That night, I stood in my apartment looking out over the city. Same view. Different life. There were still dishes in the sink, receipts in my coat pocket, texts I hadn't returned. But underneath it all, there was clarity. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was shaping things. I thought about all the women who'd messaged me since the article. Some I never met. Some who wrote from burner accounts, afraid of being discovered. One woman sent me a scanned copy of her own NDA with the subject line, "You're not alone." She was right. The firm I left eventually issued a public memo. Carefully worded, predictably vague. But inside, I knew policies had shifted. I knew Stewart's resignation wasn't the last. A quiet cleanup had begun. And I wasn't part of it anymore. That was the best part. I didn't need to watch the house fall to know I'd loosened the bricks. Marissa and I had lunch in the park that Friday. She'd joined a different firm now, one where her title matched her skill set. She wore soft navy slacks and no longer flinched when she got an Outlook notification. We talked about work, the industry, our mothers. How strange it is to grow into women our younger selves wouldn't recognize, but maybe would respect. She asked, "Do you ever miss it?" I knew what she meant. The old firm. The familiar systems. The illusion of safety. I said, "I miss the version of myself who thought good work was enough." She nodded. Then said, "But I like the version who stopped waiting for permission." We smiled and let the conversation drift. Later that week, I visited my grandfather's grave for the first time in a long while. I brought the old leather notebook, the one I'd filled with projections and plans, hope scribbled between formulas. I didn't speak. Just sat for a while, hands folded in my lap, listening to the breeze move through bare branches. Before I left, I opened the notebook to the last page and added a single line. "Legacy isn't what you inherit. It's what you correct." Back at the office, Gwen handed me an envelope, our first profit share payout. It wasn't massive. But it was clean. Honest. Earned. I went home that night and poured a glass of wine. Opened my laptop and drafted the next client strategy. Halfway through, I paused and pulled up my old firm's website. Brian's name was gone. So was Stewart's. In their place, a woman I didn't recognize, new VP of strategy. Her credentials were solid. Her photo professional. And next to her name, a short quote was printed. Progress isn't just about innovation. It's about accountability. I closed the tab. Didn't screenshot it. Didn't tell anyone. Some things don't need to be shared. They just need to be witnessed. I turned off my laptop and stepped out onto my balcony. The city buzzed below, indifferent and alive. I didn't need a parade. I had something better. My name. My peace. And the last word.